Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for Behind Girlhood, It's Complicated, a conversation with the curators of the National Museum of American History exhibition that is currently shown and that will be traveling around the country until 2025. My name is Melissa Hafaf, and I'm the program director for the Gender Justice Initiative at Georgetown University. We are a cross-campus effort designed to nurture and support research and projects related to intersectional gender justice. And we are pleased to partner with the Women's and Gender Studies program at Georgetown to present this program to you today. We are delighted to have a phenomenal panel that will take us behind the scenes of envisioning, designing, and curating a large exhibition dedicated to girlhood, past and present. And I sure hope we can get all to see the exhibition once we can safely return to visiting museums. The moderator for the conversation today will be Professor Marcia Chatelain, who I will be introducing shortly, and the four curators who will be taking us on this journey about and around Girlhood is Complicated are Mireya, Loza, Kathleen, Franz, Nancy Bercaw, and Vong. Thank you all for making the time for being with us today. As we will speak about girlhood today, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the life of Mireya Bryant, a young Black girl who was only 16 years old when she was killed by a police officer in Columbus, Ohio on Tuesday, as Derek Chauvin, the murderer of George Floyd, was being convicted. Mireya is among the countless Black and brown children and adults who have been lost and continue to perish in the hands of police violence, state violence, and white supremacy. And we know this violence is systemic and is deeply intersectional and demonstrate anti-Blackness and misogyny, and that Black children and youth don't get to be treated as such. Mireya's girlhood was senselessly interrupted when she was asking for protection. Mireya was brilliant and vibrant. She loved making TikTok videos, loved fashion, and talking about her edges and hair. We will remember her as such. We send our solidarity and love to the families who are mourning the loss of their loved ones. Thank you. Now I will introduce Professor Marcia Chatelain, who will be moderating the conversation. Professor Chatelain is a professor of history at Georgetown University and is the author of two great books that I recommend you to look into. One is called Southside Girls, Growing Up in the Great Migration, and the second one is called Franchise, The Golden Arches in Black America. Dr. Chatelain has published about the Girl Scouts of America, Black women's food writing, and the intersection of civil rights and capitalism. At Georgetown, she teaches courses on American childhood, Black women, and social movements. Thank you very much. Now I will pass it on to you, Marcia. Thank you.
Thank you for joining in this conversation about what I would say is really a remarkable, in many ways groundbreaking exhibit at the National Museum of American History. For those of you who have yet to experience the fullness of this exhibition, it not only demonstrates innovative thinking in the framing of 20th century US history, it also is a testament to the incredible creativity and resilience of the team that had planned an opening before COVID and has had to adapt in order to really stay true to the central mission of the Smithsonian Institution, and that is creating lifelong learning opportunities for people everywhere. And so I have the pleasure of briefly introducing our panel before they present on Girlhood, It's Complicated. With us today is my colleague in the history department and my dear friend, Mireya Loza, who is associate professor of history and American studies here at Georgetown, a leading scholar in labor history. She was a former curator at the National Museum of American History. We also have Kathleen Franz, who is the curator in the Division of Work and Industry at the National Museum of American History and associate professor of history at American University, who has written extensively on women and gender history and the history of technology and business history. We have Nancy Bercaw, another incredible curator at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. She is the deputy director of the new Center for Restorative History, and she had previously worked at the equally amazing National Museum of African American History and Culture as part of the incredible Slavery and Freedom exhibition team. And finally, we have another curator from the Division of Work and Industry at the National Museum of American History, Sam Vong, whose work focuses on building collections related to Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, including a current project related to the concept of a nation of sanctuary, which explores the long history of sanctuary politics and refugee experiences in the United States. And now I'll turn it over to the museum experts to guide us through the exhibition. I'll ask them a few questions, and then I ask you to provide your own questions and remarks using the Q&A function in the webinar.
Well, thanks, Marcia, so much, and thanks, Melissa, for inviting us here today. And it's a great privilege to give you a behind-the-scenes look at this show. But we all really want it to reopen. We want you to come down to the museum and to visit it in person. And if you're able to do that, and we're in that space, feel free to reach out to me or to anyone on the team who's at the museum. We'd love to show you in person around the show. So I'm gonna share my screen probably for about 5 to 10 minutes, give you kind of an overview of the exhibition and some of the parts that you won't see if you walk through. Then I'm gonna hand off to my colleagues to walk you through the ideas of the show and what's in place. So I'm gonna share here. Hopefully everyone can see that. All right, so here we are. Girlhood, It's Complicated. No truer name her title has ever been given to an exhibition. This process took about 2.5 years, which is about half the time it usually takes the National Museum of American History to develop a show. So usually it takes about 5 years. And you can see here we opened, we're supposed to open in the spring of 2020, and that was delayed by the pandemic, and we opened in October and then quickly closed again. But the show will be in place at the museum through January of 2023, and then traveling around the US for another several years to major venues. So hopefully you'll be able to see it in DC or on its travels. So here's the opening panel for the show. And this was really a commission from the Smithsonian, which is also unusual, to the National Museum of American History. So this came from the big legislation that was passed for the American Women's History Initiative by Congress, a 20-year effort to try and get a museum of women's history in the US and in DC. And with that legislation came an appropriation to the Smithsonian, and that eventually came to the National Museum of American History to say, can you please do something for the anniversary of women's suffrage in 2020? This was in 2017. And so the museum said, yes, of course, and actually holds many items related to the movement for women's suffrage in the early 20th century. And then it came down to our team, and we held a charrette, invited a panel of scholars, and had several streams of inspiration. And one was Dr. Chatelain's work, and we were so inspired by her scholarship on girlhood that we said, hey, let's not talk about women's suffrage, let's talk about girlhood as a way into gender and thinking publicly about the lives of girls, giving them a public history and recognizing their public influence and public voices. So that's sort of where we started. We were also very inspired by Teen Vogue. We were all reading that at the time, and we chose these big categories. This is how the show is organized here around news and politics, which is really a sort of a meaty introduction to the topic of girls and politics, and influence, fashion, education, work, wellness, And then some freestanding cases that are biographical as well as topical, called A Girl's Life. So you'll see all of these when we do our walkthrough. Here's our big team, or at least parts of it. The thing to know about exhibitions is that they don't spring whole from the earth. They are made by many hands and the work of many, many people. And our team, I would say even our core team, was about 30 people. So project director, which is myself, project manager, the core team of curators, and then designers, people who do lighting, people who do animation. This is a multi-institutional or multi-unit show that spans not just American history, but the institution itself. And you can see our wonderful panel of scholars who we were bouncing ideas off of throughout the process. So like I said, this really took about this really hardcore every day working on this for about 2 years. And then we put it into production to design and fabrication. So that is reading the historiography, doing lots of research, mining the collections, looking for objects, which is really how we tell our stories in the museum, is through oral history and through images, but really also through the material culture.
Kathy, I don't want to interrupt. It seems like people are not seeing the advancing of the slides. Do you need to activate the slideshow?
Really? Okay, let me go back. Let's see if that helps. How's that?
I don't see it. I wonder if it's.
Can you click on the second slide and see if that works? Like,
Is it, I'm advancing, so.
So your screen is advancing, we're just not seeing it?
But you can see my screen. I can stop share and reshare. How's that?
Why don't we do that?
Okay, let's do that. Okay.
Zoom sometimes gets haunted. My experience.
Okay, so hopefully you can see that. How is that? Ah, okay, great. Okay, so here are those topics I was talking about, which are pulled largely from the topics within Teen Vogue, but with these cheeky sort of undertitles like Body Talk, which is really discourses about girls' bodies. And then we talk about it as wellness. And then here's our team. Our large team, and we really wanted on this hello panel that people see to get a sense of the number of people behind making an exhibition. And then our design inspiration. So I was talking about, you know, the reading and research and writing that goes into this, and looking at objects, really mining the collections. But you really start with a design aesthetic. And we, after talking to this, our group of scholars, we really worked with designers from the first few weeks of developing the show and the idea. And what we gave them as design inspiration were zines. A lot of us came of age in the late 80s and 90s and were reading and participating in zine culture, and reading now the wave of scholarship on zines. And so we thought that would be a great design aesthetic, not magazines, but the ways in which girls have taken the messages directed at them, cut them up, remade them, remixed them, and used that as a voice. So here's a mood board for the exhibition, and Lucy's Angry is taking shots at Sassy magazine, which I really love. And then our designers, H&R, who are here in DC, told us, you know, if you're going to have this kind of aesthetic of a zine, we should hire an illustrator. So we hired a young woman illustrator, Crystal Quills, and she took historic photographs from the collections at the National Museum of American History that we had earmarked for use in the show, and turned them into these wonderful billboards or covers for each section of the show, which really build a kind of identity for it and help users or audiences as they walk through to think about these individual sections as zines. The other good thing about zines and having these sections is that once the show travels, it can be broken apart and rebuilt in each space much more easily. We didn't want to do a chronological history of girlhood because we didn't want to be comprehensive. We wanted to have it to be topical and really, topics that people would care about and would resonate. But it also makes it so much more difficult to rebuild it, say in Dallas or Minnesota or LA, if it is a chronological show. The other thing we loved about Crystal Coles' work is that she really gave new life and to the show and to the experience of being in the space. This is not the best angle here, but when you stand in the middle of this gallery, you are face to face with girls and eye to eye. You cannot in some ways look away from their experiences, which is what we wanted. We also did extensive audience testing and conversations. So from the very beginning of the process, we had whiteboards out on the floor of the museum. We talked to folks. We said, if we do a show about women's history or about girlhood, what would you expect to see? We also talked to scholars. That was our charrette. Card sorts are the things where you put out big pictures of objects and ideas and you let people reshuffle them and curate the show themselves. And then we take that as another stream of inspiration for what topics to address. And near the end of the writing process, so about 75, 90% way through developing the exhibition, so this was 2 summers ago, we took everything, all of that writing down onto the floor of the museum in July and let folks just come and put sticky notes up and say, I don't think this resonates with me or anyone I know, or really, what about talking about this? And so audiences really pushed us to be really bold, to take risks, to talk about difficult histories. And so we felt we had permission from them to stand up for the topics that we really wanted to address. And then what we heard back was that, a lot of people want to come to exhibitions to have intergenerational conversations. They come mostly in families or in big school groups, but we wanted to build places into the exhibition where people could come and respond and share their ideas. So this is a postcard section near the end of the show with 5 big questions, including did anybody you know as a child or yourself work? What would you think politicians should know about girls today? And you can post-COVID, hopefully, write on those postcards and put them on the wall and share them. You can also take it home and send it to school board or legislator, or you can, if you leave them with us, we plan to archive them in a kind of girls' response archive for the exhibition. The other thing that exhibitions allow us to do at the National Museum of American History is to collect contemporary histories. And there were many collecting opportunities here. Because of the timeline, we couldn't follow up on all of them, but we did connect individually with donors and to larger projects in the museum that were collecting along similar lines. So one is Nancy Bercaw's project on collecting around the Dream Act and Dreamers, and you'll see that in the show. Another is collecting contemporary experiences of girls who are in farm work, particularly migrant workers, for Dr. Loza. And then a third was that after reading a lot of teen Vogue, the team really knew that we wanted to collect a prom dress, and in particular, a prom dress that was used to advocate for a movement or to speak politically. And we actually found Isabella Ayukuli Cornell through Teen Vogue. She was featured. She's on the left-hand side of the screen with her prom dress from 2018. She's a young Choctaw woman. And then you see her in the middle here with her mother and a group called the Matriarch. And you'll see Sam Vong in the back, and he can say more about this in a few minutes. And then the designer is on the right here, Della Big Hair Stump, who with Isabella designed this dress to really speak on her behalf to make people aware of an ongoing genocide of missing and murdered Indigenous women. So I'm going to leave that for Sam to tell you more about, but it was another example of working with communities and doing contemporary collecting that fed into the exhibition, and the dress is currently on view. We also mine collections that exist and have existed for quite a long time at the museum, and here are some examples of things that were pulled together and held up to a new wave of scholarship on girlhood and rethought and remixed into the show. Another piece that most folks don't see is way behind the scenes in our conservation lab. And this is one of the conservation labs dedicated to textiles. Here are all the textiles in the show. We're waiting for fashion writer Robin Gavon to come and look at things with us and write about the show. And so this is, everything gets treated, housed, delicately handled, and then photographed. But in this case, we use the opportunity to not just photograph, but do 3D modeling of everything in the exhibition to make it available to audiences, but also to scholars, and particularly scholars of textile and costumes. Some of these things are super delicate. So it's an act of preservation too, to have a 3D model. So here we are. And this 3D modeling took weeks and weeks to accomplish. Often, this is Anais Perez, our photographer for the project. And this costume, which is Dominique Dawes's uniform from the Atlanta Olympics, only took about 6 hours, but some of the more complicated stuff took, 10 to 16 hours of all still photography, up to 3,000 still photographs per object to build these models. And you can get those models, both as 3D models, but also in a small number of cases, these three objects here as ARs, augmented reality. So if you're teaching a class on girlhood, you can drop one of these onto the desk and look at it in 3D as a hologram and really talk about it. And these also have interpretation with them based on the exhibition. So that's some of the things that you probably don't get to see when you walk through the show. But I'll drive, but I'm going to hand it off now to Nancy Bercaw, and we're going to walk you through the actual exhibition. Nancy, hopefully this will work and people will be able to see it. So you should be seeing the model populate here.
Thanks, Kathy.
Yeah.
I'm not seeing the model popping up yet.
Let's see.
And thanks everyone for coming.
And then I'm going to reshare. I'm not quite sure why
That works.
Did that work? Okay. Just need
Yeah.
a little push. Right.
So Kathy showed you all the entrance to the exhibition, but I want to start by going into the first section. Of course, it doesn't have to be the first section, but it does with our current layout, and that's news and politics. So we really saw news and politics as being the second introduction to the show, because it is called Girlhood, It's Complicated. It's not a history of girls, it's a history of girlhood, and that girlhood makes girls political. And so what we say at the very outset, because of our donors and because of even some congressional representatives, is that people really saw this as being a Democratic issue or a Republican issue. And we're like, no, women's politics and girls' politics goes way beyond that. That really, if you're growing up listening to the advice, the mountains of advice that get heaped upon you, especially when you're coming of age, And if you go through the school system or our structures of work, you're constantly being told who you are. And in that process, you develop a critical self. And so you become political, you become self-conscious, you become, and sometimes you become active. So this can be through your dress, it can be through all sorts of different ways where you really talk back. So we started with a wonderful video that's narrated by Mireya Loza. And it really positions girlhood as being beyond. We felt like we needed to really break up people's concept of what girlhood was, that often girlhood can be seen as being very pink and have a lot of ballerinas and a lot of hair ribbons. And so we said, well, this is not really everyone's girlhood. And so Mireya in this video really unpacks the different ways that girls become political and what it means to be political. And we also collected from Naomi Wadler, who spoke for the March for Our Lives. Naomi was 11 years old when she spoke before a crowd of thousands. And she really became known for this iconic, wonderful scarf that she had around her neck. And it's always hard for me to stay within the 10 minutes because I always want to tell the story about Naomi's scarf. So Naomi, of course, being 11, wrote her speech the day before. Her mom comes home from work. Naomi is having a fit. And it's because she's having trouble with the speech. And so she gets the speech all together. But then the problem is what to wear. And if any of you remember being 11, what to wear is pretty difficult at that age when you're coming of age, right? Because suddenly so much is being placed on your body and who you are. And so she really wanted to wear this certain outfit, and her mother wanted her to add color to it. So her Aunt Leslie stepped in. I guess voices got a little loud and Aunt Leslie heard. And Aunt Leslie went and said, I'll take care of this. And she sat down and knitted this scarf, and she called it her 2 movie scarf. So that was the scarf that Naomi wore the next day. And I just think it's really wonderful because girls are political, you know, that while they're very young. And so the thing that I love about that story is that it speaks so much to childhood, and it also speaks to a very mature political reasoning at an early age. Okay, so now we will zoom around and go to the first section, or the second section you encounter, and that's education. So, you know, when we had the Teen Vogue magazine and we divided it up and thought about these different categories, the one thing, Kathy, can you scooch over so we can see the label? I know that could be a little tough. Yeah. That then we had to divide them all up. And so I was assigned education, and I was thinking education. I have a working knowledge of education because I teach the US History Survey, but really I didn't know where to begin with education. I could do it chronologically, but that didn't seem very exciting. I considered doing the school day where we would do before the bell, during the day, at lunch. But then what we really settled on was, what is the work that this section would do for the exhibition, right? So how is education fitting in the scaffolding of the exhibit? What role can it play in forming or communicating the thesis for the show? So every section is kind of a building block that is building a larger argument that you actually walk through, which is why I love exhibits. So I really felt strongly that girl, the word girl and the word girlhood is not uniform by any means. And I really wanted to unpack intersectional identity. And I definitely wanted to avoid any additive approach by dropping in queer or Black or Indigenous or people of color, just as like accent stories throughout the show. Instead, I wanted to focus on the root causes of intersectional identity. How are intersectional identities built, experienced, and constructed in school? So we settled on this topic that we call being schooled. So in school, you're taught where to fit in. You confront places where doors are open to you or that doors are closed to you. And also, I think what is the most deep in many ways in regarding school is that certain futures become open to you. There are certain ways that you can either imagine yourself in certain positions, or that futures are closed off to you and people try to limit your imagination. And of course, throughout this whole process, children and girls are talking back, and they are still trying to maintain themselves when faced with this. So we're thinking about being schooled, and one thing we wanted to start with was the very first question. And the first question is, who gets to go to school and who gets to stay in school? So if we could go over to the Minnie Jean Brown story. So you can't really get into this section without confronting this story. And one thing I love about exhibits is that they're nonlinear. And so you're absorbing information from all sorts of things as you stand here. You see the words, you see this beautiful gossamer dress, and you also see the young Minnie Jean Brown, who is one of the Little Rock Nine, trying to get to school through a phalanx of soldiers and screaming students. And so one thing I like about exhibitions is that you can juxtapose these things. So you juxtapose the harm of the troops that are standing there in the screaming crowds, the harm by the fact that Minnie Jean was suspended and expelled within that first year of school for actually speaking out and talking back, but also the fact that by the time Minnie Jean graduated from school, which was from a high school in New York, she still saw the fullness of herself. And she designed this graduation gown, which I just think, or graduation dress, which is just beautiful. It speaks to, she said she wanted to be as beautiful as possible on that day. And it just speaks to her inner sense of herself and her dignity. But the final thing I want to call attention to is that little graphic on the bottom. This whole question about who gets to go to school and who gets to stay in school has been an ongoing issue. So the adultification of children of color is something that has been an issue for centuries, and it's also an issue today. So we included the suspension rates where young African-American girls are suspended at 6 times the rate of white girls. So then the next thing I want to touch on are the 2 sections which really grapple with what it means to grow up as a girl going to school in a capitalist democracy. So where do these intersectional identities come from? And as you can see, thank you, Kathy. Look at, she's doing such a great job at steering us. The first thing I wanted to unpack was how we're schooled for work. So I think we're all familiar with the fact that when you go to school, some programs are available to you and some are not. Some schools have gifted programs, some schools have honors programs, others do not. And what that's doing is it's really opening up doors for some and closing doors for others. And it's because certain people have an imagined future. So if you think about an intersectional identity, how is your identity being constructed about what doors open and what doors are closed to you? So for school to work, we look at school to be ladies, which I would argue, I tried to put this in the label, but it never quite worked, but we still have girls who are schooled to be ladies. Then there are schooled to be wage workers. And then finally schooled to be secretaries, which was really entree into the middle class in about the 1920s up through the 1970s or 80s. And even though all girls of all races and ethnicities took those typing classes, employment was closed to almost everyone except for white girls. So we really just want to think a little bit about how schools are schooling us for different futures. Then we approach the same thing with citizenship. And it's going to be hard to navigate there, Kathy, but it's that big structure right there. You go. Right in the center. So that really, when you're coming into the exhibit, you pretty much have to stumble across this particular case. And what it's looking at, once again, is citizenship and how we're all being schooled for the nation. But one thing my work with undocumented organizers has really hit home, even though I was aware of it before, is that citizenship causes great peril. that citizenship for most Americans is associated with rights. But what you know, if you're African American, or if you're Indigenous, or if you're undocumented, is that citizenship does not give rights. You know, that with African Americans, and there's a whole section on freedom schools where we look that citizenship did not provide free and equal education. There's a section on Indian boarding schools where we look at how citizenship was forced upon people by taking children away from their parents. And finally, the politics of what it means to be undocumented today is that people have to end up fighting for citizenship, a thing that divides people, in order to get basic access to higher education. So the final section I'll talk about is just the dress code section, because I realize I'm probably running out of time. But when you think of education and girlhood, you're probably thinking, you know, that school educates what are girls' subjects and what are boys' subjects. And so I looked at that with schooling the brain. But also, school is constantly giving you messages about how you, what your body means and what it should mean. And the thing that really is the most sobering about it is the fact that girls' bodies are seen as being extraordinarily powerful and extraordinarily dangerous. And so we looked at dress codes from 1905 up to the present. I got really interested in this because my grandmother raised me on the story of her being dress coded in 1920. But we worked with girls who had just published this major report with the National Women's Law Center called Dress Coded. And I worked with Jilly Towson, who you can see right there, with her checkered skirt and her white top. And we really worked with these girls, and what the report was focusing on DC public schools and how girls of color face different ramifications and have their bodies policed much more harshly than others. So the final section, because this section is an awful lot about how boxes are made around girls, the final section is Unschooled, where it looks at how girls break out. And so it really looks at walkouts, and it looks at walkouts for all sorts of different issues. Since it's a video, it begins in the 60s, but if we could work beyond video, we could have pushed it way far back in time so that girls have taken action and have spoken out by literally walking out of school. So now I'm going to hand it over to Mireya.
Hi, everyone. I'm actually going to give a very brief kind of overview of this section work because I'm really eager to have the discussion and to hear your thoughts on what we built, because as of now, very few people have gotten to see it. And this is kind of amazing that through the power of technology, you're actually able to sit and see an exhibition that is currently not open. But this section is inspired basically by workers. I'm a labor historian, and I thought to myself that I know that girls had a history of working. And the history of working that we may all sort of be more familiar with is the history of girls contributing to the domestic home, the history of daughters and mothers. But I started thinking about the history of people who work not in their for their families or with their families or in a domestic sphere of their own, but folks that are working from childhood on, and it is through work that their childhood is erased. And so the actual first image you see is Crystal Quills. Basically, she took a photograph from the Library of Congress that I gave her, and she drew the moving carrot girls, which are farm worker girls. In the current period, farm worker girls, or I should say, children continue to work in farm work, and girls across the nation work in agriculture. So that's Crystal's rendition of it, but I'll show you the very first example, which is girls as domestics. We're all really familiar with this idea that African-American girls worked also in fields. But what I wanted to do is present a different and distinct story of African-American girlhood. A lot of parts of this exhibition are really inspired by Marcia Chatelain's book, Southside Girls. And if you haven't read it, I suggest you go out and get a copy. And so I thought, how do I pull back that history of young African-American girls? And we know that they're there, but how do I do that with collections that we don't have? How do I do that with very limited, basically, sources? How do I tell this story? So I actually decided to tell a story of young girls who worked as domestics, because I thought, again, this is a story that also renders their lack of girlhood very visible, hyper visible. When you see this portraiture and this genre of portraiture where families would have their little white babies photographed with their Black caretakers that are clearly children, you see that juxtaposition and you realize that these girls were never set up to have a girlhood. And so I thought that this was a quite distinct story. And these are, again, girls that aren't participating in their home economies. These are not their families. And I wanted to render their labor visible. And I thought, what a beautiful way to also bring them to life in the actual exhibition space. And so, along with a lot of my team members, when I said, let's blow them up large so that we can actually not only see them eye to eye, so that we can engage with them as human beings and see their lack of girlhood staring us in the face. And so this is the very first place we enter. And then we move on to a more classic story of girl workers, which are girls basically working in mills. And we at the National Museum of American History had a beautiful collection of objects from various textile mills. And so that was quite interesting. And again, I said, I want to get the largest piece of equipment on the floor that we have, and no one batted an eye. This is going to travel, let me tell you, and it weighs a ton, this Throster, sorry. So again, no one batted an eye and everyone said, let's do it. And I kept thinking, when is someone going to say no to me and say this is impossible? And the very last story I wanted to tell is girls as farm workers. We also cover radium girls, but girls as farm workers to me was a near and dear story. I write on agricultural workers, and I thought this is basically one place where we can see the rights of girls, not necessarily, and their girlhood, not necessarily being respected, acknowledged. And I was horrified when looking at the numbers. In a 2016 study, a quarter of our fruits and vegetables are still picked by children. And when I talked to folks at the Department of Labor, I was horrified to find out that the Department of Labor keeps numbers of children who work in various countries globally, but not the US. So the Department of Labor looks at child labor across the globe, but not in the US. I leave you with that, and I hand it off to Sam Vong.
Hi, Kathy, did you want to jump in and give an overview of wellness? And
you can do it too.
Sure.
Sure, okay. Sorry. Oops. Okay, well, Sam, do you want me to do it?
oh, sure.
I muted myself, and I'm having some problems with the model here. So, but wellness, our next to the last section here, is really all about, again, it connects well with school and with work because it's all about the messages that shape and to try to define girls and girlhood, and the ways in which girls have pushed back against those messages, including asking the question, who wants, not just who gets to be a girl, but who wants to be a girl, who thinks they fit that identity, how you remake that identity, and how the identity of girlhood is not, it's so, we work so hard in the US in terms of writing advice literature over 200 years to make this category seem naturalized. And we wanted to show it as a construction and not as something that is naturalized. So I'll hand it off to
Sure. Maybe we can turn to Ryan's story. So one of the ways that we wanted to really complicate this concept of girlhood and show that it's show that girlhood and gender are social constructs was by exploring the story of Ryan. So what you're looking at here is the case of Ryan's story. So Ryan was born intersex. He was raised as a girl. And for most of his childhood and young adult life, Ryan really struggled with his gender identity. So growing up, he felt that, and this is paraphrasing from some of his, from his letters and his diaries that he donated to the museum, he felt that he had a boy's mind in a girl's body. When Ryan, later in his adult life, Ryan transitioned to male. So Ryan, who is also a fellow public historian, co-curated this case that you see here. And he gave us a title for the case, appropriately called Not Checking the Boxes. And the idea for this title and the case is that binaries, the binaries that we're confronted with, such as boy or girl, male or female, don't really capture the full spectrum of our gendered experiences and our gendered identities. So in this case, what we feature are objects that Ryan donated to the museum, including a high school letter jacket, Ryan's umpire's mask, his yearbook, as well as a baseball card featuring Ryan. He also donated, so all these objects, a suite of objects, really reflect his he was an avid baseball player and an umpire, and this was really a central part of his identity. Right, if you look right behind his the letter jacket and the case, you also see a collage of photos that were donated by Ryan. And these photos show Ryan when he was younger and a teenager. And we wanted to really create this collage to show him in his social and familial settings. We didn't want to simply isolate his transgender experience, but we really wanted to illustrate his humanity, right, as a whole person. I think one of the most compelling objects in this case, Not Checking the Boxes, is the diary that Ryan donated and which we reproduced. So it's this oversized diary that you see with a little picture of a picture when he was younger. So we made a replica of one of his school journals that he created when he was in the 7th grade. This journal was part of his 7th grade assignment, and he referred to this diary as his Anne Frank diary. And this diary really captures or offers a window into how a young person, such as Ryan, was trying to navigate and come to terms with his own gender identity and sexuality. So this case as a whole, I think, really complicates this notion of girlhood as a construct. And it shows how the binaries of girl, woman, girl, boy, man, woman are really kind of limiting and don't really capture the full experiences of what being a girl or a boy is. Should we move on to, Kathy, in the interest of time, should we move on to the next section, fashion?
So Sam, I'll let you give the overview and talk about the dress.
Sure. So this dress that you see here is in our fashion section. So this beautiful red dress you see was worn by Isabella Ayupley Cornell, who is a citizen of the Choctaw Nation in Oklahoma. So she wore this dress, as Kathy mentioned in the introduction, she wore this dress to prom in 2018. And her motivation to wear this dress emerged out of her activism with the movement for the missing and murdered Indigenous women, women and girls, which Bella was involved with since she was 14. And so she wore this dress because she wanted to highlight the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And so this dress is really an illustration of how girls are political and how they repurposed kind of social events like prom to express their political activism and be political, right? And to get their voices, their political voices heard. So this dress was featured in Teen Vogue in 2018, and one of our exhibition designers had actually brought this dress to our attention. And so Kathy, Nancy, another curator, Nancy Davis, and I had reached out to Bella and her mom, and we explained a little bit about the exhibition to them and our goals. And several months later, I traveled out to interview Bella and her mom and to collect this dress. And there was a lot of, I think, there was a lot that Bella and her mom had to consider when donating this dress, because given the fraught, especially given the fraught history of museums and their relationship with American Indian communities. So Bella had to consult with her aunties as well as tribal elders to see what was the best way to donate this dress. And they wanted to ensure that the stories of the women who are represented in this dress are told in a respectful and dignified manner. So it has been an honor to collect this dress, and we're honored to both have this in our exhibition as well as steward it. So I think stewarding this dress has been such a privilege because because Isabella and her mom really entrusted us to tell the story. It is a object that is not only about prom, but it is a story about the embodiment of thousands of experiences of Indigenous women and girls who have gone missing. And so it's a very powerful it's a very powerful vehicle to tell these really important stories. So
I think we're headed on to the last 5 minutes for Q&A.
yes.
Excellent. I'm going to moderate the questions. Please use the Q&A function for questions for this incredible panel. I know that Mireya, you said that you would take the first question that comes from the Q&A. How does this exhibit include girls with disabilities?
So actually, we've taken account disability in two ways. So there are stories. There's one story in the actual exhibition, but also disability is something we think about profoundly all the time because all of this has to be accessible. And so we have to be ADA compliant, and we're eager to always explore the new sort of ways in which we can be accessible to all audiences, whether it is through the text, visuals, through all kinds of functions. But one of the stories we tell is Helen Keller, because we had such great objects. And so we had Helen Keller's pocket watch, and we decided to incorporate it. We also find Helen Keller's story appear again a second time, very briefly in the story of Little Girls as Domestics, because Helen Keller's family basically had African-American girls as their domestics. So it's complicated.
The next question in the chat, how will tours for school groups be taught in terms of boys and girls? I don't know if I understand the question. How will tours for school groups be taught in terms of boys and girls? Maybe this lends itself to Shiva's question about gender binaries, broken down more. What do you all think about the idea of girlhood itself? So what does it mean kind of from an audience reception perspective and in terms of how you frame girlhood in the exhibition?
Well, can I respond to the boys and girls question? Because I think we had something like that come up in the charrette, where many people asked, like, how will my son feel in this exhibition? How is my son going to interact with this exhibition? And we all thought telling the story of America through the purview of girls is not a leap for most people. We live in a world with basically gender fluidity and complicated concepts of gender. And so to take a moment to look at it through that perspective probably does a lot of folks who identify as young boys some good.
I would also just ask Sam if you're comfortable, because he's one of the members of the team on our National Youth Summit, which are using Girlhood as the basis for the summit this year, to talk about gender identity and binaries and how it gets made and unmade. Sam, do you want to say a few words?
Yeah, so our National Youth Summit, which is going to be held in mid-September for several days, is going to use the exhibition, some of the objects and stories from the Girlhood exhibition to explore gender. And I think the exhibition lends itself to really exploring what it means to be a boy, what it means to be a girl, and to think about how this concept of gender and gendered identities are relational and socially constructed. Yeah. So, the summit will not only be about girls, but it's also a way to invite men, boys, people of different genders to explore how gender is fluid.
And someone asked about how the exhibit deals with the issue of menstruation, pregnancy, or child marriage.
Yes, I can take that one. We didn't have a lot of audience feedback on pregnancy or child marriage, but we had a lot on menstruation and menarche and de-shaming of menarche, and understanding that not everybody gets a period, that period over time, it took a long time for medicine to figure out what periods were, and along with that co-constructing then what female meant and what motherhood meant. So we're a little bit limited by our collections on that. So we do talk about it as a public dialogue over time around menstruation and through advice literature, and try to break that down for folks. There is another exhibition that will open in about a year and a half across from this one on the history of medicine. And they are going to have a large section on the female body and on menstruation.
Folks, we are, I don't know if we're at a hard stop at 2 or 2:15, but
we have some time.
Oh, we have some time for more questions. So please continue to put your questions in the chat, and or in the Q&A, and I'm going to look at the chat. Someone asked, is there an exhibit catalog or accompanying book that will come from this project?
My goodness, there are a lot of products that are coming out of this. It's not a traditional exhibition catalog. There is through SI Books, which is associated with the Smithsonian, but a for-profit trade press. There are 2 books coming out specifically aimed at younger audiences. So one is going to be a graphic novel, much like a zine, with a superhero girl that travels through the exhibition topics. And then there's another one that is going to take basically a series of books, one on each of these topics. And then there are a couple of products that are coming out digitally. So there's going to be a build your own zine packet for schools and others that will allow you to take any piece of the drawings here from Crystal or objects and put them around topics that you want to talk about. So those are a few of the publications there.
One of the questions in the chat asked about the process of designing this and says, what was the participation of girls at the museum in the original charrettes and the feedback you got? And how do you engage folks who might not be museum goers?
I'll let somebody else jump in there. We did pluck girls out of high school classrooms that work with a colleague and friend of mine, Cosby Hunt, at the Center for Inspired Teaching. But anybody else want to jump in?
In terms of reaching people who are not museum goers, that's always difficult. And I think often you have to move out into communities in order to do that, because just our building itself is not welcoming for all people. But we have seen in other exhibitions that sometimes the content of an exhibition can draw people in who are not typically museum goers. And so we're hoping that that'll be true here. And I also think the National Youth Summit that Sam was talking about, I think hopefully will open this up to a wider group and provide access in different ways.
There's a follow-up question around these kind of categories, and I think this is a really important one about age. How do age groups shift across countries and cultures, and here too? How do we take that into account when we are designing an exhibit about girlhood?
I'll take that one. I think for me, it was particularly difficult in part because the examples I give, many of these girls are considered adults when they're working at 15, 16, 17, 18. And so in some ways, we had to be a little sort of looser with our idea of the age span of a girl. And then again, in the fashion section, we see it emerge as a topic because we cover periods like the post-war period where teenhood gets invented, right? And so what does it mean to walk into a new age group, which is a socially constructed teen group? And so we're constantly thinking very loose and flexibly about these categories, and also decided to kind of read against the grain and give folks an opportunity also just to identify themselves as girls, regardless of that sort of age marker.
And to follow up on that kind of question about, about categories and identities, what are the ways that, if you think about the beginning of this project framing, about thinking about issues of suffrage, right, and this very kind of narrowly defined celebration of women's history, to one in which girlhood provides you these different kind of outlets and entry points, what are the ways that, your exhibit is also speaking to the ideas of rights and self-possession among a population that doesn't have certain rights and certain opportunities to kind of make their own decisions? Like, what are some of the ways that we can better understand girls as actors in society as a result of this exhibit?
I was thinking, Kathy, you should talk about community property a bit.
Oh, I can do that. I was also going to say, we every time we usually give a tour to a general audience, like we're giving a tour to FedEx employees next week or 2 weeks from now. We draw the line. We have to say it in kind of a soundbite, but this exhibit is similar to looking at suffrage in that we look at how girls may not have had a vote, but they have political influence, or they, we look at the stories in which girls often disenfranchised, mostly invisible, and almost always erased by museums. We are trying to recover and give a public history to, but we look at the voices where girls have pushed back and tried to have social and cultural and political change. So, but one of the most complicated, I think, among trying to find examples and think about that is the one Nancy mentioned on girls' bodies as community property, because we saw that throughout the literature. We saw that in our historical examples that were captured by the museum. There's a huge collection of Miss America things. And, we really wanted to think about how girls have been asked, unlike boys, to embody, not just become role models, but really be the bodies of these big ideals, sometimes connected with nations, sometimes communities, and then think about using their words to critique that and what do they say. And I'll say too here, the curatorial hand is there, but we really, in the words that we wrote and reproduced, we really relied on the voices of individual girls. So we looked at girls and young women who talked back about being those representatives. So the Miss America who quits in 1953 to go work for civil rights in Alabama, where she was from, because she didn't want to take the cheesecake photos. She was like, I don't know why I got into this except for the scholarship money, and y'all want me to be the body. So I'm not going to do that, and walks off. And we had a number of people like that who, I'm sorry that one of our curatorial assistants, who is now a full curator at the museum, Veronica Mendez, who really worked on that section, isn't here to talk about it. But that's one example. Did that, Nancy, did that get at what you wanted to
Yeah.
say? Okay.
And I was thinking more to Marcia, your question about the fact, like the whole notion of a voice but no vote, it's kind of like how people in the nation are always struggling because they really don't have a vote or they don't have rights, and how that's kind of in some ways obviously imperative. So when I'm working with undocumented folks, it's like, of course we get out the vote more than anybody else because we know exactly the importance of getting out the vote because our lives hang in the balance. But on the other hand, the fact that their very real needs are not even represented by the vote. So the fullness of a person and a personhood and what you really do need in order to maintain your humanity and your human dignity is something that's not often encompassed by our politics. And so I think it's this pushing category.
One of the questions, I love this. Someone says that they want to take granddaughters to the exhibit. As their grandfather, how should I prepare them for a visit at 11 and 7 years old?
No, go ahead.
I'm actually super excited about bringing my nieces and nephews. And I think one of the things that I find really just exciting is that I want my niece to be able to see that girls have been dynamic characters throughout American history, just shifting, changing how we think. Basically, Americans should be what they should be. And I love that, young girls can't vote, right? That's the whole premise of the show. They're not voting, but how is it that they're actually changing America over time? And so I often think that young children are asked to see themselves through examples of adults, and they actually aren't asked to see themselves through examples of children in the past. And, one of the things I remember telling my niece as I was showing her some of the material we were developing, I said, look at this girl. She's 9 and she was doing incredible things in the 1950s. What are you doing, Grace? And she said to me, stop. Stop. I was like, because there's a sense also that we are in a better place now, that history is teleological. And these young girls were pushing ideas and being dynamic about and creative about their responses to politics, to exploitation, to their home lives. And so I want her to be able to take from those examples and use them.
One of the wonderful recommendations from the Q&A is a book. Judy Heumann's recent memoir, Being Human, is a recent story about the impact of a young girl not being allowed to go to school. And this relates to the earlier question about girls with disabilities and who gets to go to school and who doesn't. For our final few minutes together, I kind of want to put this, this exhibition in context. How has the history of childhood and children and youth been part of the agenda of the National Museum of American History, and what do you think this this incredible project will do for scholars in the future, inside museums and outside of museums? What do you imagine the impact of this kind of project having for the future? Historians hate predicting the future.
I'll say that, curators at the museum and the U.S. National Museum before it were collecting and ways that intersect with this topic around schools in particular. Nancy can talk to that. Some of the collections there are quite old, and around textiles, particularly samplers and sewing in schools and costume. But what we wanted to do, just like not really answering the question or call to talk about suffrage, was, you know, do it really from new angles and not be so beholden to the object categories. You know, like these are school objects, or these are, you know, confirmation objects, or whatever, religious history objects. So I'll say that I hope, you know, since it hasn't been open, I haven't talked to a lot of our colleagues at the museum to see what they think in terms of busting categories. People have said the show is very fresh. I hope that's a compliment. And it looks different than other exhibitions. So I put some, I'll hand off to my colleagues, but I put some things in the chat that Melissa is going to share. But part of the digitization is to open things up to scholars and others who, not just folks who can't visit, but to be able to bring the objects. And we have diaries that the Transcription Center at the Smithsonian has been transcribing and putting up as part of Girlhood. So giving those kinds of access that we hope will lead to more, at least in my hope, more material culture and visual culture analysis of childhood and girlhood. So, yeah.
All right, no one else wants to take the final word on this, but I'm going to just encourage everyone to follow the digital resources that have been shared in the chat to explore all of the incredible scholarship in the history of girls and girlhood, and to just thank you for joining this conversation and to express my incredible gratitude and amazement and awe at this curatorial team and the creative folks that you brought together for really a remarkable and incredibly noteworthy and I think field-changing exhibition. So thank you so much to the team, and Melissa, thank you for bringing us all together with gender justice.
Thank you so much for the wonderful panelists for taking us on this private tour. We feel extremely privileged. And thank you, Marcia, for moderating the conversation. And yes, please go. I mean, we hope to see the exhibition soon, and I'll also share with all of the attendees and people who registered all the resources we shared today, so people can also go and see what has been digitized. Thank you so much. Have a great day. Have a beautiful afternoon, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.